Greetings. If this costume looks familiar, I'm recording this on the same day for next week, where I'll be in Los Angeles visiting family and gathering materials for the next installment of the African American Experience, in which we cover the 20th and 21st century. Last week I began with talking about the ancestors in the wake of the lessons learned. If somebody wanted to learn a lesson about the election, where the forces of enantiodromia, basically where there's progress, there's going to be backlash, there's going to be progress, there's going to be backlash. When Obama talked about reconstructing America, he was basically cleaning up the messes of the Republicans, recession, creating tax cuts, which basically gutted the infrastructure of the country. Then he was trying to clean that up. They resisted him at every turn. And then those 8 years of whatever progress he made basically gets subject to the backlash of the predictable backlash of President Trump. So when I want to take the long view, I basically tune into the experience of the ancestors. This is ELMINA Castle in Ghana, the west coast of Africa. This is the slave fort that was constructed by the Portuguese, originally to mine gold, but then they used slaves to export to the so-called New World. When slaves were basically exported through this door, the coastline, actually the water ran closer to the fort, and so they basically went down a gangplank there. In modern times, the water has receded quite a bit. The door, my great-grandmother, my grandmother's grandmother, whose English name is Roselia Goodwine, was made to walk through one of these doors of no return in a slave fort in the Ivory Coast, and then brought to America. The Negro in the cellar of a slave boat, which is kind of, even though this is a Wikipedia image from Wikipedia Commons, I'd say that this is a cleaned up version of what it actually was. This artist's conception basically makes it look a lot more spacious than it actually was, probably for illustration purposes. But the point being is, no matter how bad it looks, how much people are freaked out by the election results, Africans in America went through worse, and we survived. And we were given the strength to basically stay centered, stay calm, and move on through Reconstruction. So, what is being reconstructed here? All right? If you add Christianity and Islam, as well as animist religions, who basically preyed upon their neighbors and sold them into slavery. So when you consider that kind of betrayal, where black people are sold by other black people, not only initially but throughout the slaver era, they're sold by their neighbors into slavery to white people. So whether it's Islam, Islamic slavers selling, for example, my grandmother, who was Muslim, into slavery with racist whites, there was a sophisticated culture that was created by the slaves, by the former Africans, and basically imported into here. What is then, basically then shipped them to America, where they are stripped of their literacy, their numeracy, stripped of their languages, their religions. So, for example, if they were Muslim, then they weren't allowed to practice their Islam. They were basically forced to become Christian, and a form of Christian which wasn't native to Africa, a form of Christianity which justified their enslavement. So they were stripped of their languages, their religions, their egalitarianism, that is their equality, constrain their human rights, and then, quote unquote, free them. So when they're talking about reconstruction, and Obama talked about America as being reconstructed, then there's going to be a backlash, and we will examine what that backlash is. So what are they to reconstruct? The question could be asked. What will they be allowed to reconstruct? So, for example, in the run-up to the Civil War, in the slave trade, once the war is over, in addition to the rebuilding or original creation of an African American identity, so basically they were Africans, they were not considered full human beings in America by constitutional law, and now because of the Civil War they're almost granted humanity, and I mean almost, because not quite. There's an African American identity which you go from speaking multiple languages, practicing multiple religions, being able to recognize many gender expressions, and being reduced to monolingual, but being a multicultural culture, basically converted to Christian, but activist liberation theology Christian, focused on community organizing and uplift. Others are also practicing other Abrahamic religions such as Judaism and Islam, or doing that in secret, like the conversos of Spain were in the Inquisition. The U.S. is now free to attack the Indians. So in the interim between the slave trade and the Civil War, which ended the slave trade, now we're unified, so to speak, but the U.S. then, after the Civil War, turns its attention to the Indian nations. So the Civil War is not creating a new and just America. The Civil War basically did nothing to eliminate white supremacy or sexism or any other isms. The Indian nations, besides occupying land represented a visible cultural threat to the growing United States, which basically relied heavily on maintaining inequalities of all kinds. And we'll consider that intersectional sets of discrimination as it affects us today, but all of those systems of inequality had their roots in definitely this time period, if not some of them being at the country's founding. The Indian nations thrived without taxes, without real estate, without racial or gender prejudice, and were independent of the need for trading with the United States, even though some of them did trade with the United States. They existed independent of the United States. Oh no, and they also represented a alternative. So indeed, this trading relationship proved to be unequal at best because trading in goods rather than cultural technologies, except for the surface qualities of governing with Iroquois Six Nations, where they basically understood that chiefs could represent nations and that we didn't call it a parliament, we called it a Congress that was basically elected representatives, and basically that's similar to the system that was in place with Iroquois Six Nations, except that it was matrilineal. The women ran the polity, the political life of the country. They decided when we went to war, chiefs had to basically be at the not only beck and call, but they could be unsheathed by the clan mothers. Back to slide, thank you. So many folks, as an alternative to slavery, and after slavery was over, they often interfaced with Indian nations and the activities of the then fledgling United States, which had begun to basically take over some of the territory that used to be the former Mexico. So Buffalo Soldiers, and this is basically linked in what a website called Afro-Mexicans. The point that must be made here is the fact that black population in the early colony was by far larger than that of the Spanish. So whether you talk about the slaves and the natives, in 1570, we see that the black population is about 3 times that of the Spanish. In 1646, it is about 2.5 times as large, and in 1742, blacks still outnumber the Spanish. It is not until 1810 that Spaniards are more numerous. Both from Afro-Mexicans, so basically when you're talking about making this distinction of African Americans, Afro-Mexicans, they're still south of the border, but following the reality that today there's 130 million people of African descent in Latin America, there's also a great deal of black people in Mexico escaping slavery. So both slave and free, participating in various kinds of labor in Mexico. The majority worked in the silver mines, the silver mine centers, and largely numbered in urban centers, largely as domestic workers. Having a black servant or maid was quite the status symbol for the elites, the Castilian elites. Also in urban centers, blacks, both slave and free, worked as artisans, peddlers and craftsmen, as well as, of course, as we talked about a week ago, vaqueros, cattlemen. Africans were also deployed to rural coastal areas, such as Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico, and what is now the states of Guerrero and Oaxaca on the Pacific coast. So interestingly, this is from the website, free blacks also participated in large numbers in the military, serving during the colonial period, that is the colonial period of Mexico and Spain. So in Veracruz, black slaves were used primarily in the labor-intensive sugar industry of Exalpa of the late 16th and early and mid 17th centuries. On these sugar processing mills and cane fields, African slaves were imported specifically to replace Indian laborers because many of the Indian laborers would die because of European diseases. On the Pacific coast and the Pacific coastal plains, blacks worked mainly as ranchers and cowboys, vaqueros. Livestock was a primary economic activity of that region in the colonial period and continued to be important to this day. So the point is that historically Afro-Mexicans were found throughout the country and not only the coastal areas where their descendants still live today. So when we come to buffalo soldiers, and we have that graphic that goes along with the website. In 1889, that photograph of buffalo soldiers, they were scouts, included the then employed and retired members of the Seminole Black Indians, and that's basically the Seminoles, as I talked about a week ago Monday, was basically Floridian, if you will, for maroon, basically referring to a first-generation black and native mix, because many black people escaped slavery with the whites to live among the native people. And Seminole was basically an entire nation of those people. So a large number worked for the U.S. Army after earlier being employed in the Mexican Army. So in the Mexican Army, so remember who freed slaves first, who had a black president first, and who was the Mexican equivalent of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, except he himself was a slave, and he himself actually freed slaves and promoted some sort of equality, the equality that Lincoln and George Washington never really achieved. Africans would escape into Indian country, north, west, and south. The Seminoles originally came from Florida, where they were a branch of the Creek Nation, distinguished from other Creeks in their acceptance of runaway African slaves who had toiled in the former British colony that became the United States. Acceptance and willingness to fight alongside them, the natives, against first the Spanish and then the British. One of the reasons why the British opposed Africans and Indians getting together, for example, Jamaica and Florida being the example, as well as the founding fathers of Oregon kind of objected to that too, establishing the exclusion laws that created the state of Oregon to be a place where blacks could not come either. So buffalo soldiers. The initial blacks within the Seminole villages were bound to work for the Seminoles in a relationship that was kind of described as slavery, without whips, chains, and with a right of the bondspeople to farm their own land and crops, and also intermarry. By the time of the 1835-1838 Second Seminole War, during which the United States tried to conquer the Seminole, they were a large mixed-race nation in which those Africans, those of African heritage, took many important decision-making positions, i.e. chiefs. Dembo Factor was one of the black Seminoles who fought in that war. He's in the above photo, in the photo that's going to show up shortly. he is basically the elderly gentleman with the white beard. So, for example, in this particular photograph, Dembo Factor was a Seminole, and here depicted as a Buffalo Soldier. And so the Buffalo Soldiers were black Indian people, often used by the U.S., who basically fought in the U.S. and Mexican military, and often by the U.S. military were accompanying wagon trains. They were not involved in the genocidal wars of the U.S. cavalry against Native people, but because they were also warriors, they took on the name, or they were given the name Buffalo Soldiers by Indian nations because of not only their hair, but also because of their, shall we say, demeanor. So, Buffalo Soldiers. So in 1838, here, let me adjust this on the fly. Okay. So in 1830, in the 1835 to 38 war, these soldiers basically reluctantly agreed to leave Florida and settled in the Indian territory of Oklahoma. During the 1840s, they were harassed by other Indian nations of the territory who considered the Seminoles to be blacks and subject to capture and sale to whites as slaves. Same thing with basically the Wampanoag, Pequot, etc. During that time and before that time. So around 1850, the Seminoles began exploring the Mexico-Texas border region with basically the hope of resettling in Mexico where slavery had been abolished in 1829 by decree of Vicente Guerrero. The first effort of the Seminoles to resettle were unsuccessful. The Mexico-Texas border area was basically controlled by the natives of the area, the Comanche nation, which was basically opposed to all outsiders, native, white, whoever. The Seminoles basically developed methods of fighting off the Comanche, and settlements were basically created in the Mexican state of Coahuila. And in 1856, Mexican President Comonfort hired Seminole fighters to protect Coahuila and other border areas from the Comanches and also from the raids by white outlaws from the United States. So after the U.S. Civil War and the abolition of slavery, allegedly, many Seminoles returned to the U.S. where their Indian fighting, quote unquote, their Indian fighting abilities were acknowledged, and they became soldiers in the U.S. Army. And the Indians basically gave them the name Buffalo Soldiers because of the matted African hair, resembled the matted hair of buffaloes, who they revered, veterans of the Civil War, and other non-Seminole African Americans were basically also in Indian fighting, U.S. Army's contingent, and that contingent known as Buffalo Soldiers, because it was also largely segregated too. Black Seminoles have continued to live in the Rio Grande River. Notable Mexican Seminole town in Coahuila is named Nacimiento de los Negros. So turning now to Asante and in Africa. So there's a 150-year African-European war. So the only way, and Asante writes, the only way to view the engagement between African and Europe from 1807, the date Britain banned the slave trade, to 1957, the date the Gold Coast became independent, and chose the name of the ancient empire of Ghana, is a long, bitter continental war. A brutal war was fought between the two continents over the material wealth of one of them, mainly Africa. Africa has not declared war on Europe, but Europe has declared war on Africa. It was not a war fought on conventional terms, with standing armies, respecting each other. Europeans basically used intrigue, guile, avarice, which means greed, betrayal, massacre. African guerrilla tactics, sabotage, non-cooperation, destruction of crops, and property. Between 1492 and 1855, Europe continued, the European continent basically used its power to reach, and its power and reach were unchallenged by any areas of the world. Hundreds of tons of gold and other metals and minerals were taken out of Africa. In the beginning of, say, the 19th century, Britain stood alone in Europe as the master of the seas and the largest slave-running country in the world. The number of ships involved in the slave trade, for example, Liverpool, where the Beatles came from, Liverpool alone had 60% of all the slave ships. While Africans made up the majority of slaves, the English also ethnically cleansed Ireland and Scotland and sent many of those people into slavery in the Americas and West Indies. So, for example, when I referred to the Highland clearances, basically it was ethnic cleansing by the British, where all the men were killed and the women and children were sent into slavery in the West Indies, where, for example, in Jamaica, which is why you have Gaelic-speaking, mixed-race red-haired Jamaicans today, because no proper Englishman would mix with the Irish so enslaved, but plenty of black people would mix with those particular individuals. African disunity made conquest easier, because a lot of people would ask me, wait, if we had guns, and we had superior numbers, why couldn't we stop the slave trade? Why couldn't we stop this war? Well, African disunity made that conquest easier. There were military powers capable of defeating the now united Europe, because in ancient times, of course, there wasn't a united Europe. But, for example, the Songhai Empire, successor to Ghana and the Malian empires, had disintegrated, essentially, a little over a century after Columbus made his discovery, so to speak. So, the continent lay in disarray. Now, the Berlin Conference. Now, what the Berlin Conference was, and it's often not necessarily noted, but the United States was at the Berlin Conference. And how that was is meeting at the Berlin residence of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1884, the foreign ministers of 14 European powers and the United States established the ground rules for the future exploitation of the quote-unquote dark continent. Africans were not invited or made privy to the decisions made at the Berlin Conference. This photo is basically from a book, The Horizon, History of African American Heritage, published in New York in 1971. This is a different view of it, but an expanded view of it. So, the Berlin Conference. The convention revised the General Act of Berlin, February 26, 1885, and the General Act and Declarations of Brussels, July 2nd, 1890. The American Journal of International Law, that's in volume 1 if you wish to look that up, but take my word for it. It was signed at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, September 1919, whereas the General Act of the African Conference, signed at Berlin on February 26, 1885, was primarily intended to demonstrate the agreement of the powers, that is the European and American powers, with regard to the general principles which should guide their commercial and civilizing, note that, commercial and civilizing action in the little known or inadequately organized regions of a continent where slavery and the slave trade still flourished. Now, from this particular point of view, notice what they're doing. They're making money and they're civilizing, because they're saying this is a dark continent. There's no civilization here. There's just slavery. It's disorganized because many of the empires had, in fact, disintegrated. But there's still people living there, living their lives, and they're not in savagery. So the physical infrastructure still exists, and the physical infrastructure that was established by the pre-Egyptian Chumedian cultures that basically established rites of passage, et cetera, there had been no colonial influence up until this time. And this was basically the efforts of the Europeans and the Americans saying, okay, this is a dark continent. We're going to not only civilize them, but we're also going to make money, and that's the only consideration. Back to slide, if you would. Thank you. Whereas by the Brussels Declaration of July 2nd, 1890, it was found necessary to modify for a provisional period of 15 years the system of free imports established for 20 years by Article 4, and since the date, no agreement has been entered into, notwithstanding the provisions of the said Act and Declaration. Whereas the territories in question are now under the control of recognized authorities, are provided with administrative institutions suitable to the local conditions, and the evolution of the native populations continues to make progress. So the reason I'm presenting this is the worldview basically contained within the concept of original position. This is basically law. and how they're basically deciding that they are not using any local leaders, any local African leaders. They are basically imposing their leadership and their government and civilizing the natives. And when this is happening, they've also kind of made that decision for also Hawaii. So, but we're just looking at Africa. But the same idea, which is codified in the concept of the white man's burden, which we'll look at towards the end of the broadcast, is looking at the idea that only civilization resides in Europe. Everybody else is uncivilized, and basically since Christianity is whites only, and Christianity is being used to civilize the planet, these folks are having it done to them for their own good. Back to slide, thank you. So wishing to ensure, by arrangements suitable to modern requirements, the application of the general principles of civilization established by the Acts of Berlin and Brussels, who, after having communicated their full powers recognized in good and due form, have agreed as follows. And you can go to that web link. This is a basic map of Africa. And the legend on the lower left basically describes how they divided Africa up. Basically deciding a continent going to France, Italy, Britain, Germany, let's see, with Liberia going to America. Let's see, so if we look at the legend, Belgian possessions, British possessions, French possessions, Italian possessions, Portuguese possessions, Spanish possessions, independent nations, which basically would include America. And because America was a colony of Britain at one point, and you'll notice that Liberia is that color, and mandated. So Germany was, and I've talked to Africans who, from that former country who basically, when you talk about, well, who's the worst slaver? And they were basically saying Germans were the worst slavers, because Germans also experiment, just like American slaves were experimented on by American scientists, because the concept was they didn't feel any pain, so it's all right to do surgery on them without anesthesia, despite their cries and protests. Germans were also experimenting on Africans using medical experiments, because they also believed, like the Americans believe, or the Americans got it from the Europeans, doesn't matter, all kinds of experiments and surgeries without anesthesia, because they didn't necessarily believe that Africans could experience pain. Probably second worst, though you could, trade off, because it's kind of ridiculous to even speak in these terms, but it's all bad. The Belgians were very nasty. So Germany, the parts of Africa that it divided up and took in the Belgian conference, the Berlin conference rather, it lost its colonies in the First World War, and other countries took those over. And then World War II, when basically, Germany tried to get those colonies back, and it basically sent troops to Africa, and the combined might of Europe and Britain and the United States defeated Germany. Then what happened is those colonies that were formerly European began to get their independence. So the one good thing you could say about Hitler, if you could say one good thing about him, is he set basically the entire world, not the entire world, even though they call it a world war, not all the world was involved with it, but the best thing you can say about Hitler is that he engaged Europeans so much, and so much European energy was engaged in defeating him that it set the context for African independence. That's the best thing you can say about him, is that he involved Europe in this war, and all the energy spent in defeating them allowed the Europeans to lose their colonies and their colonies to become independent, which is not a good thing, but next slide. The White Man's Burden, which started out as a poem by Rudyard Kipling, and also a movie with Harry Belafonte and John Travolta, which did play here in Eugene, I think in the 90s or late 80s or something like that, whenever it was made. The White Man's Burden, the first reference is a poem by Rudyard Kipling, and when you look up The White Man's Burden in the dictionary, it is the supposed responsibility of white people to civilize the rest of the planet. Now, here is a cartoon, The White Man's Burden, and you can see Uncle Sam riding upon an African who's carrying him on his back. You can see John Bull representing, he's the equivalent of Uncle Sam, also riding an African. You can see Kaiser Wilhelm, also riding an African. So the white man's burden, it's the white man's burden to civilize the African. And of course, well, I'll read you the poem. Then the white man's burden, pearl soap, and in the magazine, The White Man's Burden, that accompanied the poem. So you have the stereotypical black savage with the wild hair, the big lips, being carried by and grass skirt and the spear, being carried by the U.S. Teddy Roosevelt Rough Rider figure with the U.S. on his canteen, up the hill, and there's also a buried European or American man walking past the grave, because obviously those savages don't want to be educated. He's carrying the black savage up to the schoolhouse, you see, where he will be civilized by learning the lessons that Columbus discovered America and that white people have the burden of civilizing the planet, who needs to understand that the superior civilization is the European American civilization. And finally, White Man's Burden, which is a movie with John Travolta and Harry Belafonte, which I can tell you black people saw as a comedy, because what that movie is a photo reverse of America, where black people, and it's set in LA, so black people live in Beverly Hills, and they have white lawn jockeys, and John Travolta is a poor working class man who lives in the ghetto, but it's a white ghetto. So it's a photo reverse of America. And so you have these rich black people living in Beverly Hills, and they've got all their kente cloth, and They're African statuary in these rich houses, and they have a lawn jockey, except it's instead of a black lawn jockey with white people, it's a white lawn jockey with black people in Beverly Hills. So photo verse of America, and that's why we could see it as humor, and it's basically directed by an Asian director. So yeah, it kind of turns on its head the racial assumptions. Back to slide. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. That is, the captive savages, the African savages there. To wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild. Your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Right? So again, this is, the intent of the Berlin Conference. This is a poem, 1899, Rudyard Kipling, writer of the Jungle Book, writer of all these different children's stories that I read to my children, and so did you, made into Disney movies. The White Man's Burden, published in McClure's magazine in 1899, right during and after the Berlin Conference, basically talking about the sentiment there, where we're white people and we're civilizing the planet. There's more to the poem. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. That is, the wars are being waged against the savages. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hope to naught. So sloth, laziness, and heathen folly, that is non-Christian, nativist folly. Because remember, again, this is the view that Christianity is white Christianity. Any forms of Christianity that exist are not counted, even though Christianity and Judaism and Islam are African religions. They've basically created a worldview that persists to this day that says our story is the only story that exists. Take up the white man's burden. No iron rule of king, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humor, slowly towards the light. Why brought ye from the bondage our loved Egyptian night? Now, isn't that interesting? We were in Egyptian darkness. We built pyramids, but that's still in darkness, huh? Why brought ye from the bondage? The blame of those ye better. You're better. Don't you savages appreciate being civilized? Take up the white man's burden. Ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom. to cloak your weariness. By all ye will or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen peoples shall weigh your God and you. Take up the white man's burden. Have done with childish days. The lightly proffered laurel, the ease ungrudged praise, comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold edge with dear bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Now, this would be an unremarked poem if it didn't have implications that affect the American culture for today. So this was read in Congress by Benjamin Tillman, extracted from a speech delivered to the U.S. Senate February 7th, 1899. As though coming at the most opportune time possible, you might say just before the treaty reached the Senate, or about the time it was sent to us, there appeared in one of our magazines a poem by Rudyard Kipling, the greatest poet of England at this time. This poem, unique and in some places too deep for me, is a prophecy. I do not imagine that in the history of human events, any poet has ever felt inspired so clearly to portray our danger and our duty. It is called The White Man's Burden. With the permission of senators, I will read a stanza, and I beg senators to listen to it, for it is well worth their attention. This man has lived in the Indies. In fact, he is a citizen of the world and has been all over it and knows whereof he speaks. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen people, half devil and half child. I will pause here. I intend to read more, but I wish to call attention to a fact which may have escaped the attention of senators thus far. That with 5 exceptions, every man in this chamber who has had to do with the colored race in this country voted against the ratification of the treaty. It was not because we are Democrats, but because we understand and realize what it is to have 2 races side by side that cannot mix or mingle without deterioration and injury to both, and the ultimate destruction of the civilization of the higher, meaning whites. We of the South have borne this white man's burden of a colored race in our midst since their emancipation and before. It was a burden upon our manhood and our ideas of liberty before they were emancipated. It is still a burden, although they have been granted the franchise, that is, the vote. It clings to us like the shirt of Nessus. Now, in case you don't know your Greek history, Nessus was a centaur that instructed, among others, the heroes Hercules, and was a tutor to many Greek citizens. He was murdered, and his blood soaked a shirt, which if you wore it, basically itched and was very uncomfortable. So when they're referencing the shirt of Nessus, that's what they're talking about. We are not responsible because we inherited it, and your fathers, as well as ours, are responsible for the presence among us of that people. Why do we, as a people, want to incorporate into our citizenship 10 million more different or differing races, 3 or 4 of them? But we have not incorporated them yet. And let us see what this English poet has to say about it and what he thinks. Take up the white man's burden, no iron rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. He goes on, but Benjamin Tillman, a senator from the South, basically saying that the races cannot commingle, that if they do commingle, it will not improve the black people and it will drag the white people down into savagery. They cannot be equal, and equality is, let's see, to quote a skinhead Trump supporter, that diversity garbage. Back to slide. Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a fictional person who represented type 4 legal discrimination, which I will explain what that is towards the end of the broadcast, but I have talked about it in small detail just to introduce the concept. Now you will note the visual grammar of this. There is a crow, the bird crow, and that Jim Crow is a black person, but actually it was a minstrel show where white people played black people in blackface. So it has a very much racist history, and so the U of O professor, Dr. Schertz, who basically played, well, she said she was honoring a black doctor, Miss Dr. Tweedy, who wrote a book about being a black man in a white coat. She wore blackface, and I don't know that that was her hair, but blackface and a afro wig and a white coat, basically saying that she was Benjamin Tweedy. This is in the tradition of blackface. Jim Crow. Jim Crow, the song. Jump Jim Crow is a song and dance from 1828 that was done in blackface by white comedians. White comedian Thomas Dartmouth, T.D. Daddy Rice. The first song was supposedly inspired by the song and dance of a crippled African slave called Jim Cuff or Jim Crow, variously claimed to have resided in St. Louis, Cincinnati, or Pittsburgh. The song became a great 19th century hit, and Rice performed all over the country as Daddy Jim Crow. As a result of Rice's fame, Jim Crow had become a pejorative, had come to mean a pejorative meaning African American by 1838, and from this law, for laws of racial segregation, became known as Jim Crow laws. So American apartheid is Jim Crow. The expression to jump Jim Crow came to mean to act like a stereotyped stage character of a black person. See also Uncle Tom. So the Wikipedia version. Come listen all you gals and boys, as just from Tucky-Ho, I'm gonna sing a little song. My name is Jim Crow. Chorus, after every verse, wheel about and turn about and do this just so. And do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Well, I'm not necessarily going to do that anymore, but Jim Crow, I'll leave it up on the website. Lynching is not Willie Lynch. Now I have talked about, and I will let you know, I suppose I should, in the interest, because this is a broadcast and will be YouTubed, the following will, I'm going to give a, a trigger warning. Now in previous classes, I've noticed an interesting thing. When I show this to black people, the black people they're not actually traumatized, they just kind of nod, yep, and the white people are traumatized. This was a reality that we lived with and were told about and were talked about, and so it just became part of our culture to know about these terrible things and not necessarily talk about them with white people. And there have been various ways of portraying that. Every movie that has basically been portraying slavery except Birth of a Nation has not shied away from talking about the reality of lynching during slavery, but also it was also carried on during the Jim Crow era and even into the present day, and we'll talk about those present day lynchings when we get to the 20th century. But lynching came from Captain John Lynch. So this is going to be lynching photography in a few slides, so get ready for it. Don't have any children unless you're black. And the reason I say that is because I was told about lynching after my first racial attack at age 7 in Disneyland. I was told about Emmett Till, who was lynched. So, Captain John Lynch, who became a model for what could politely be called frontier justice, but was often described and as recreational or in culinary terms, i.e. barbecue. Some are more horrific than others, like the lynchings. Some lynchings are more horrific than others. I was raised with this knowledge by people who witnessed or personally knew victims of lynching. So it was basically a standard secret knowledge with those basically raised, quote unquote, old school black, to teach their children early and often about what you're about to see, and if you haven't seen this before, what you haven't seen, what you will see basically for the first time. So when today they speak of a war on terrorism, this was terror on American soil with no sanctuary for the targets of lynching, and the victims and the survivors. The cavalry was not coming to rescue us. Neither the Lone Ranger or Zorro, even though the Lone Ranger was based on an actual black person, basically he was portrayed as a white person in popular media. So this is the last warning. The following slides have links and content that could be considered child abuse if you were a white child. If you were a black child, this was the standard version of the unvarnished, unsugar-coated African American experience and was required viewing at any age that experienced potential or actual racial attacks of any intensity. So while I just had a cigarette put in my hoodie in Disneyland in 1962 and the hoodie began to smolder, that was a mild attack. But Emmett Till, who I was told about later that night, merely for either whistling at a white woman or putting his change from his candy in her hand and having her jerk back, and that was what prompted the whistle, he was brutally murdered and tortured. And at the trial, they admitted killing him, but they were acquitted of the trial. So thus, when we're talking about modern day Black Lives Matter, police getting away with shooting unarmed civilians, police even killing black police officers, basically serving no consequences for that, lynching is still going on. So, I was made aware of lynching at 7 with the example of Emmett Till. It was out of our parents' fear that they gave us a whooping to keep us self-disciplined. The beatings might not be random as racial attacks, but we were assured white people could do much worse for no reason at all. So where this comes from, it was a website, a traveling art exhibit, and now a coffee table book, which I actually possess. My parents didn't necessarily have, I didn't give them a copy of it because they lived it and they told me about it, so I didn't really feel a need to, expose them to it. But I possess it. It's not necessarily on my coffee table, but I do have a copy of it, and it's available at black bookstores, wherever black bookstores are found. When you're seeing this, I'll be at my favorite black bookstore in Los Angeles, getting not necessarily a copy of this book, but the book is called Without Sanctuary. And what it is a series of photographs, all of which have the common factor of they are lynching photography that was sent in the mail as postcards. It's not only black people, it's also Italians and Jews. So white people who have been lynched. So it's not just the black people, but this book is a collection of lynching photography, all of which has been sent through the mail as postcards, and it's curated as an art exhibit. So this is one of those code words and cultural artifacts that I said, and that I've concluded, black people did this. Basically, not only as a teaching, as a warning, but as an example of the kind of thinking that the white man's burden leads to in terms of policy, where people were lynched basically with either no trial, at random, and Well, I've stalled enough. So I'll describe the lynching of Jesse Washington. So Jesse Washington was a mentally retarded 17-year-old boy. On May 8, 1916, Lucy Fryer, a white woman, was murdered in Robinson, Texas, 7 miles from Waco. Washington, a laborer on her farm, confessed, quote unquote, to the murder. Now, yeah, okay. In a brief trial on May 15th, a week later, the prosecution had to only present a murder weapon and Washington's confession. Now, a reasonable person, that is a legal term, a reasonable person with reasonable doubt might ask as to motive. Why would a mentally retarded boy kill his employer? Did she beat him? Was it self-defense? A reasonable person might ask, how was the confession obtained? As in, legally? Did Washington actually do the murder, or was he beaten into a confession? Not unknown in 1916 in Texas. The jury deliberated for 4 minutes, and the guilty verdict was read to shouts of, "Get that nigger." The boy was beaten and dragged to the suspension bridge spanning the Brazos River. Thousands roared, "Burn him!" Bonfire preparations were already underway in the public square, where Washington was beaten with shovels and bricks. 15,000 men, women, and children packed the square. They climbed up poles and onto the tops of cars, hung from windows, and sat on each other's shoulders. Children were lifted by their parents into the air to get a better view. Washington was castrated, and his ears were cut off. In a tree supported the iron chain, that lifted him above the fire of boxes and sticks. Wailing, the boy attempted to climb the skillet hot chain. For this, the men cut off his fingers. The executioners repeatedly lowered the boy into the flames and hoisted him out again. With each repetition, a mighty shout was raised. Lynchers often paraded their victims, or what was left of their victims, down the main street, through black neighborhoods, and in front of quote-unquote colored schools or churches that were in session, that they might absorb the lesson. Here's the picture. This was a postcard sent through the mail by the man leaning on the utility pole. This is basically, well, what's left of him after being burned. Charred corpse, and this basically is the caption that reads in the book, "Charred corpse of Jesse Washington suspended from utility pole, May 16th, 1916, Robinson, Texas, gelatin silver print, Real photo postcard, 5.5 by 3.5. Written on the back of this postcard, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with a cross over it. Your son, Joe." Joe would still be considered a normal, well-adjusted, sane human being by today's standards. Dylan Roof would be considered the man who shot up, the boy who shot up, the person who shot up the church in South Carolina. Even now, they're actually attempting to find a mental illness. He's questioning whether he's competent to stand trial, which is interesting because if he were black, they wouldn't be seeking a mental illness defense. If he's white, well, white people have not actually determined that racism is a mental illness. Only black people have done that. So yeah, we could say, as a racist, he is mentally ill, but Western psychology doesn't believe that he is mentally ill. So we have to conclude he's a normal human being, because since he was socialized. Back to slide, thank you. If Washington had been found innocent and still treated in this manner, no jury would have convicted Joe. This is part of the African American experience. To be aware that you could have to carry the burden, and responsibility of terrible and wonderful secret knowledge. And like Cassandra, to be not believed in either case. So, fact, the terrorism which maintains slavery is still very much present. The white man who killed James Byrd, who was basically killed in the 20th century, are the first white men in Texas to be sentenced to death for killing a black man since slavery. Now, when Mr. Byrd was killed in, I think, the late 90s by being dragged to death behind a truck by a chain, and his body came apart. They left, this is also in Texas, they left his body, or what was left of it, in front of a black church. And when these men were convicted, they were the first men convicted of killing a black man since slavery. The black man who was killed in slavery was someone else's property. Then the man who basically killed him wasn't even his owner. So he was put to death as if he had killed or stolen a horse, because this is Texas. But if the slave owner had killed the slave, there would have been no charges because it's his property. So the white men who killed James Byrd, one of them, I believe, just got executed relatively recently. Basically were the first white men to be convicted and sentenced to death in Texas for killing a black man since slavery. Back to slide. So the question is, and the reason that this is titled Picnig is when you look at, there is a black urban legend, and I make the distinction between black urban legends and generic urban legends because in black people's case, they are actually true. They actually happen. They actually, did occur, but white people don't believe them. urban legends like, the exploding poodle or et cetera, yeah, they could be fiction, and they kind of grow and as the meme grows. But picnic, or the word picnic, comes from, according to the dictionary, comes from the word pique-nique, the French word pique-nique, to randomly select food for an outdoor outing. Now, there are frequent references in lynching photography to foods that exist at a picnic, like barbecue and consumption of barbecue. This is the nigger that we barbecued, was said of Jesse Washington. So, violence by normal red-blooded Americans. So this is the African American experience. To be aware of the possibility that normal Americans could commit violence against you, and not be considered mentally ill, and you have no legal recourse nor psychological help for the trauma. So we haven't seen such disregard for human life since the last school, theater, or temple shooting, not to mention church burning or church shooting. And this is why I believe school shooters are not mentally ill. They are simply acting out the programming that they got from society. Now, I want to further take the last half hour or so, 25 minutes or so, to basically go through the entire construct that helps Black psychologists and students of Black psychology survive. So while I switch slides here, let me see. All right. You recall I introduced a concept, a word called conscientious zone. Conscientious zone. Okay? Is not a noun. It's a noun, a verb, and a state of being. This word comes to us from the Portuguese, coined by the late Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. And it means, and it's defined, learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and take action against the oppressive elements of reality. Now, growing up African American and growing up in a household with a Black doctor whose friends and relatives were also Black doctors, I learned about Black psychology. Like, how do you respond and keep your mental sanity in a culture where you can be attacked at any time for no reason and still maintain a degree of sanity and mental health, calmness, and be able to thrive? Well, you do it by conscientious zone. And since 1965, when Black psychologists, Harvard-trained Black psychologists defined racism as a mental illness and began to describe what it was, and then basically tried to get racism classified in the DSM, I believe it was 3 then, and the night that they were going to present that, they got together in a hotel room, and then the news of Martin Luther King's assassination came through, and they kind of not dropped the ball, but they were in shock. Because again, if America killed Martin Luther King, what hope could black psychiatrists have of defining racism as a mental illness? And the APA, the American Psychological Association, which basically came from the idea of Southern physicians that basically said that slaves were mentally ill for trying to escape slavery, and women were hysterical and mentally ill for wanting the vote. If that's who was basically deciding who was sane, what kind of chance would we have to begin to look at racism as a mental illness? And where we were going with that, and I basically claim myself among them because I'm continuing the work, is not that racism, skinheadism, whatever, can be cured with Prozac, but there would be a talking cure for the targets. I use the word targets rather than victims. So conscientious zow is the process. Learning to see those contradictions where basically horrible acts are committed by normal, sane people as society defines them, and that seeking freedom is designated as insane. So we have to do a double think. So conscientious zow. Conscientious zow requires that you know what a healthy functioning condition is, either by practicing it yourself or seeing enough of the condition to want to emulate it. The practice of freedom comes from taking action against oppressive elements of reality. What some in addiction treatment texts call problems related to the social environment could either mean one's social group or one's relationship to society, being problems related to social environment. In the face of social inequalities, the counseling relationship should really address these issues in the client and with the practitioner. So part of healthy functioning in a human being is memory. And if you this class is designed to fill in the blanks, not only for black people, but for white people or anybody that watches the broadcast, reads the book, practices the constructs, and works with the constructs of freedom. So, a liberative discourse, if you will. So, it is most likely the first ism was sexism, or discrimination against women. About the time of Abraham, with the erasure of the names of the goddess, Alat, who is named as one of the goddesses of Islam, the 99 names of the goddess being turned into the 99 beautiful names of Allah, the suppression of the goddess Alat in favor of Allah, and basically a male-dominant Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. So the Holy Trinity in Christianity being changed from Mother, Father, and the child of true humanity, and all the goddesses that are referred to in Judaism basically were erased. And so then we were left with a male sky god. And basically, if you do an anthropological study of what happens where the supreme being is either neutral for gender or female, you don't have child abuse or rape, and women share an egalitarian social context. Said the other way, if the God is male, then you have the enslavement of women, the rape of women, and child abuse. So they go hand in hand. And there's very few cultures where that doesn't happen. Food for thought. All right. So, the 6 types of isms. Type 1, verbal and physical assault. We have seen during this campaign in 2015, 2016, an increase from microaggressions to actual verbal assault or physical assault. Type 2, nonverbal microaggressions, but we've also seen that the work that has been expanded from the original work from Chet Pierce, Dr. Chester Pierce, used to be nonverbal, but then it was expanded to verbal microaggressions that are not directly ethnic slurs, which then elevate them to a type 1 verbal assault. So 2 types of individual, type 1 and type 2, these are committed by individual, and 4 types of institutional isms committed by institutions at various stages of evolution, if you will. So type 3, unconscious institutional. That is, the institution is unconscious that individuals within it carry out type 1 and type 2 and have various privilege systems going with them. Type 4, conscious institutional legal, that is when it's legal to discriminate. So Jim Crow, apartheid, Nazi Germany, the state of Oregon, it's legal to discriminate against sets of human beings based on immutable and visible characteristics. Type 4 is a stage of evolution as well. Type 3 institutions, unconscious institutional, basically is when the institution is unaware that it, or makes no policy that changes from the legal discrimination to illegal discrimination. So for example, type 5, conscious institutional, it's illegal, that is, the discrimination is against the law, but it still happens because it's profitable to happen. And that means that since it's illegal, it doesn't necessarily happen in the open, but it becomes a standard practice. So when I described, for example, redlining in my house, that was type 5 institutional illegal discrimination. And type 6, socio-structural violence. This is where the violence occurs and is carried out by institutions, not by individuals, though individuals can carry out the violence normally because they are socialized to. So we're going to focus on these constructs and this gradation. The 6 types of isms is my construct in the sense that I basically categorize them as 6, but they come out of the Black psychological and legal literature because type 1 are basically covered by case law, type 5 are covered by case law, socio-structural violence, those things are not covered by case law but remain practices. So we're going to basically focus on racism because the original constructs of these came out of racism, the study of racism and the response to racism, though later the isms translate mimetically, if you will, across characteristics. So when we talk about, even though it's memes in this 20th century understanding, back in the 70s, we began to talk about intersectionality. That is, there are other systems of discrimination in operation that coexist and force multiply with racism. So, the 6 types of isms. Type 1 and type 2. First 2 are basically interpersonal between individuals and groups of individuals. The next four take place through collective action and institutions. So, type 1, verbal physical assault, overt verbal or physical assault through physical contact or even electronic media contact or verbal contact. They call you a name or use fighting words. For example, the Supreme Court ruling, nigger is a fighting word. You assume that anyone using that word is threatening immediate physical violence. Therefore, is not unexpected for you to launch a preemptive strike upon the utterance of that word. Electronic media have a physical and psychological effect, but the case law has not caught up to as to how to deal with cyber harassment and cyberbullying. Type 2 isms. So type 2 from Dr. Chet Pierce and Dr. Daryl Wing Su et al. Racial microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal behaviors and environmental indignities where intentional or unintentional, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostility, derogatory or negative racial slights and insults to the target person or group. So when Chet Pierce first came up with the concept, he was a Navy Commodore studying extreme environments in Antarctica, and basically determined that it isn't the extreme cold in Antarctica, the darkness in Antarctica, that makes you go mentally ill. It's the little interactions and daily slights that were coming between people, mostly men, who essentially, put each other down, like male banter. And it just got under your skin, and that's where you got driven mentally ill. He took that work and basically, because he was black and a Navy Commodore and a psychiatrist, basically came to the conclusion that being black in America is like being in Antarctica. You're not going to get lynched every day, and people aren't going to be lynched, but you are going to experience derogatory behavior that doesn't rise to the level of being called a racial name, but still might declare you as under. So he came up with that concept in roughly 78. In 2007, Daryl Wing Su and others basically expanded upon Chet's work and basically said there's 9 species of microaggressions. So they're not limited to human encounters alone, but may also be environmental in nature, as when a person of color is exposed to office setting that unintentionally assails his or her racial identity. So, for example, the blackface thing. For example, one's racial identity can be minimized or made insignificant through the sheer exclusion of decorations, literature that represents various racial groups. Conversely, the simple inclusion of a few token posters, pictures, art, books, or people cannot be interpreted as relieving microaggressions. Who or which culture created the office culture, which would normally assail any racial identity other than white male? Who created that office culture? Where did that come from? Who has allegiance to maintaining that culture? So the academe is part of generating and maintaining office culture. We have, for example, human relations at work, even though there is some inclusive subject matter. Who creates office culture? So type 2 isms are basically, in addition to the 9 species, there are 3 categories: micro-assault, an explicit conscious racial derogation characterized primarily by a verbal or nonverbal attack meant to hurt the intended victim through name-calling, avoidant behavior, or purposeful discriminatory actions, referring to someone as colored or oriental, half-breed, or as I've heard recently, what type are you? A prairie or a timber or a sand? And so that, prairie nigger, sand nigger, forest nigger, timber nigger. Well, I guess I'm a freeway, skyscraper, ghetto nigger, because I'm from Los Angeles. And LA County is the largest reservation of Indian people possibly on the planet outside of the Navajos. Displaying Confederate flags would be, or swastikas, would be considered also a microaggression. Old-fashioned racism, conducted on an individual level, often in private situations that offer the perpetrator anonymity or insulation. It can take the form of telling a person of color that another person used racial terms and then denying saying anything when the person of color basically reports or confronts the other person. Perps often hold notions of minority inferiority and will display them publicly in loss of control situations or when they feel safe or threatened or anonymously protected. So micro insults, another category, communications that convey rudeness and insensitivity, demeaning to a person's racial heritage or identity, subtle or not so subtle snubs, frequently unknown to the perpetrator, but clearly conveying a hidden insulting message to the recipient of color. Examples, African American innuendo, the most qualified should get the job regardless of race. How did you get your job? That is affirmative action, quotas, got you your job, which you were otherwise not qualified to get, or you took it away from a qualified white man. White instructor basically fails to acknowledge students of color in classroom, or eyes glaze over when non-white concerns are aired. And then micro-invalidation. Micro-invalidations are characterized by communications that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person of color. Compliments about one's speech or diction with underlying assumptions of foreign birth. So for example, you speak very well for a minority, you speak English very well. The way I speak, if people didn't see me, a lot of people assume I'm white. Happens all the time. I don't see color. We are all human beings are often statements that neither acknowledge, negate, or neutralize systemic discrimination. The effect is to negate the experiences as racial and cultural beings, regardless of the intent of the speaker. So 9 species of microaggressions: alien in your own homeland, ascription of intelligence, you seem to be smarter than I would expect a person of your race to be. Assertions of colorblindness. Colorblindness is a form of microaggression, i.e. racism. 2, assumption of criminality, or criminal status or criminal background because of your race, denial of individual racism, the myth of meritocracy, pathologizing cultural values or communication styles, second-class citizen, and environmental invalidation. Now, Sue talks about environmental validation as a microaggression, but environmental validation as actually, within the Black framework, sociostructural violence, because institutions don't do microaggressions. By their very nature, because they're institution, they're macro, which is the only point of disagreement I would have with them. But that's, again, within the Black science, so there we go. So alien in your own homeland. Basically, you are not a real American, you are not qualified. Ascription of intelligence, assigning or being surprised at intelligence, color blindness, race and culture do not really affect people's lives. You are making excuses, playing the race card. Criminality, or assuming criminal status. This is a quote from my lone driving while black stop in Eugene, in which I was asked, when was I arrested? And I was arrested, and I said I was arrested once when I was 17, and the cop said, 17 arrests? No, I was arrested once when I was 17. What was that for? Theft? So again, it was for weed, but okay, we'll leave that. I'm a drug counselor, so yes, I have inhaled. Okay. Denial of individual racism. Your racial oppression is no different than my gender or class oppression. And if it's usually a white woman that says that. Myth of meritocracy. You need to work hard. If you don't succeed, it is your own individual fault. And pathologizing culture or values or communication styles. Borderline personality disorder, when you are loud, emotional, and confrontation. Social anxiety disorder, you basically diss you when you avoid eye contact. Second-class citizen, level of welcome, or white preference shown, and environmental invalidation, building names, pictures, staff, reflecting that you don't belong or only white people can succeed. You are an outsider. So I will also put up the rest of the construct to include the slides on through socio-structural violence, and we'll see you on Wednesday.
Nazitoziva Maria Sika ndipo pawanda.